is Dean Warwick, and he has a very interesting story to tell. So, without further ado, we'll go over to Dean Warwick in Scotland.
Right, good evening, Dean, and first of all, welcome to Revelation Tapes and agreeing to this interview. Now, before we get down to the nitty-gritty, I wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became involved with what you did and so on.
Well, I think that begins right back soon after when I was born. My grandfather was a very close friend and had a lot to do with my upbringing along with my parents. My grandfather was the Secretary of the New Zealand Justice Department and Prisoners Parole Board. He was a 19-20 degree Mason. He was not keen on certain aspects of Masonry, although he admitted it had to be a part of his life. He studied Chinese detection and became world renowned for it. Could pick people from a crowd and put tails on them, which was done regularly, well known to me as a child, being first-hand evidencing these events. He told me something as he was dying. He had cancer, and I spent a lot of time with him. I was about 15, and he said that later on in life I would learn something which he couldn't divulge to me, something that would practically destroy me. And I am quite convinced I do know what it is that he was talking about, and it is truly horrifying. It is not being made public. I have yet to see, read, or hear anywhere of evidence of that which I have learned of, and have many confirming reports from police around the UK and from church groups that I was mixed with in the United States before coming to the UK. I was drafted into the New Zealand Army. I topped every course during my officer's training preparation for Vietnam. I was taught how to bring down the Twin Towers using nothing but infrasound.
Really?
We were made to study the experiments by the Russians, the Americans, and the British in the late 50s.
In the late 50s?
Late 50s. This was mid-60s when I was in the military. But here were these joint maneuvers being undertaken in the late 50s by these three superpowers then in the Eastern Bloc, bringing down 25-story buildings using nothing but sound wave, infrasound.
Good heavens.
And I did discuss this recent years with a Professor Francie, who remarked, and don't, this, that, and the other thing with respect to that 9/11 fast that we saw. And of course we all know that Michael Meacher, who was a cabinet minister, was removed from office because he publicized the fact that he had read word for word what was to happen to the Twin Towers 3 years before the event.
3 years before the event?
3 years before the event. It was a well-planned thing. It was a well-known thing as a civil and structural engineer, and I have teaching instruments, postgraduate universities, polytechs around the world in my research into certain aspects of engineering, that is, and I knew that there was a calling many years before that the Twin Towers would have to be, should be demolished, which was an engineering facet to the overall game here. And what people do not understand when it comes to New York is the New York Port Authority demand that any building erected in New York must be able to be brought down within its own footprint. In other words, we don't want a 50-story building falling sideways.
Sideways, no, not at all.
Terrible damage. Now, there is something with the Twin Towers which many people have not picked up on. Apart from the films that we have seen, and we see, for example, or we didn't see for 6 months, we saw nothing of the second Twin Towers building being hit on its face. And I was suspicious about this, thinking there's something they don't want us to know. Then we were told there was to be this screening of this bit of footage showing the plane actually strike striking in the face, and I made a point of seeing it. I sat in front of the television, I saw the plane strike, and I put my head in my hands and I said, "Oh, you bastards, you bloody did it all right." Talk about some Muslims taking over planes, etc. Forget it. I couldn't establish and prove that with the first Twin Towers building, but certainly with the second. And what I saw was, as the plane struck, or the hologram presentation of a plane when it was really a pod that struck, was that the actual structure, the material making up the external skin, each section weighing around 40 tons, it behaved exactly the way it should have done had it been influenced by infrasound, which is what I witnessed with the training that I was doing in the mid-60s, watching what the Brits, the Russians, and the Americans had been doing in Eastern Europe back in the late 50s. So I don't believe much of what is 9/11. The other thing with 9/11, which very few people, well, in fact, again, I haven't seen anything spoken of publicly about this, but there is a building, and about 15-20 stories up off the ground, if you get a look at it, you will see that the corner of this building, which is way distant from the Twin Towers positioning, 3 of its floors are torn apart on the corner. Now, there was no way that material from the Twin Towers could have flown out and struck that building.
Not at all.
So, in my discussions, arguments with Professor Francie, I said that as far as I was concerned, that infrasound influence upon those buildings was satellite-based. And, of course, his remark to me was, "Well, how could that be, Dean?" He said, "We couldn't have anything from space coming in by way of sound wave, infrasound." And I said, "Yeah, but it could be electromagnetic, and then it's transposing itself as it gets within our atmosphere." The thing here to understand is that people don't appreciate the only thing that travels through space. Light, there's no such thing as light from the sun. It's electromagnetic radiation. And in the event of light, for example, it's when that electromagnetic radiation enters the atmosphere of the Earth, it agitates the gas, and that is daylight. There's no such thing as light from the sun, and that's how, for example, we don't have to look at photographs and analyze them of Aldrin and Armstrong walking on the moon. We know they didn't take photographs on the moon because there's no such thing as light on the moon. We see the moon because we see a reflection of the electromagnetic field striking boulders, craters, and mountains, and comes back down into our atmosphere, where it is then lit up and becomes like going to the cinema. Anyway, with respect to the Twin Towers event, something other than conventional thinking would have to have applied, but this building is the telltale that that was not struck by debris from one of the Twin Towers, and so what influenced it to be broken apart? And the thinking for me was that it had to have been some form of infrasound that was played on a large area in which the Twin Towers occupied. And Professor Francie was I was taught how to bring down the Twin Towers using nothing but infrasound.
Really?
We were made to study the experiments by the Russians, the Americans, and the British in the late